It's not an issue in which both sides, one is completely absolved, the other has engaged in it. It's something that in one way or another in this conflict has affected both sides. It's a long, checkered, difficult history.
A Russian drone strike has hit Ukrainian port facilities at Ishmael on the River Danube, a short distance from NATO member state Romania. A grain warehouse and elevator for loading grain were damaged. Almost 40,000 tons of grain destined for African countries, China and Israel, were also left unusable. Russia began targeting Ukraine's ports after abandoning a UN deal that enabled the safe grain export between both countries across the Black Sea. Well, let's speak now to Thomas Pickering, the former United States ambassador to Russia and the United Nations. Good evening, Thomas.
Good evening. Nice to talk to you.
Thomas, one of the main concerns here is that the target of this strike was actually filmed from the Romanian side of the Danube, which is only 1.9 miles away. And you could see this extensive fire raging in this port area. The Russians are clearly, they're teetering on the edge here when you're that close to a NATO state.
I think they are. I think that the whole air war, missiles, drone strikes, and aircraft has ticked quite a bit in recent weeks. Part of this, I think, is coming as a part of the Ukrainian counteroffensive against the Russians. Part of it is deep frustration in Ukraine about the concerns they have of staying away from attacks on Russian territories. And we've had several attacks against government buildings in Moscow in recent days. Part of it is obviously Russian efforts to reinforce their approach to block Ukrainian grain shipments and using the target in Ismail as a way of doing what they can to eliminate Ukraine's capacity to do that. And so we're getting into a situation where essentially the war is expanding, particularly the aerial war. It is increasing in damage and volatility, and there appears at this stage to be little, if any, capacity to bring it under control, even if, in fact, there were to be concluded at some time in the very near future some resuscitation of the grain deal, some capacity on the part of the West to allow the Russians to achieve the objectives that they seek, which are to export more grain and fertilizer and so on. So it's a complicated mess. It is not getting better. There are dangers for both parties and dangers for expansion of the conflict, as you pointed out, particularly close to involving NATO members.
Now there's a slight hum.
Which would cross a line here.
There's a slight hum on your line, Thomas. So apologies if you can hear that if you're listening at home or in the car. But we'll keep going. I just wanted to ask you about where this grain was actually destined for, because it was almost 40,000 tons, and it was heading to many African countries, which Putin recently held a Russian Africa summit in Moscow with. And these are many of the countries that Putin wants to keep on side. So, Thomas, what's the game plan here with this grain from Russia? We understand he wants to disturb what's going on, but why would he disturb the grain that is heading to those countries that he needs to keep on side?
Well, I think it's fairly simple. He's offered within the last week to provide free grain to at least 6 African countries. Some of those may well be among the countries that the Ukrainian grain was destined for, and he will find a way to replace them, increase his own goodwill, and at the same time make himself out internationally as someone he hopes that is seen as friendly, responsive, and concerned about the humanitarian impact of the loss of grain shipments to places like Africa.
Now, of course, a number of foreign ministers have accused Russia of deliberately putting global food security at risk. But, Thomas, do you think there's any possibility of that grain deal being resurrected?
At the moment, it doesn't appear to, although it is quite clear that President Erdogan has something of an important role to play here. Recent reports have indicated that Russia-Turkish relations have gone downhill. Whether Russia would like to improve those, whether doing the grain deal or some variant of the grain deal in which they get their grain shipped and their fertilizers sent overseas as part of a joint deal, remains an open possibility. I don't have enough information to tell you that I think it's proximate or not, but it is a possibility.
Ships have continued to sail across the Black Sea to Ukraine's ports on the Danube. And, grain can also reach the Danube by road, rail links via Moldova, as well as Ukraine. But all this does hurt the Ukrainian economy, doesn't it?
It does, and that this is a major, I think, focus of the Russians in terms of their recent attacks, including the one overnight against the grain storage facility in Ismail.
How do you see Russia's use of drones, Thomas, in attacking these facilities? Using drones from such a long distance. I mean, overnight, just last night, Russia launched more than 10 drones against Kyiv, according to local officials. But the targeting of grain facilities by drones seems to be something that Russia, at the moment, as the grain deal has collapsed, is not afraid to go after.
That's true. There is, put it this way, a tenet of international law that says neither side on a conflict like this should use its capacity to attack, interrupt, or destroy grain or other food facilities as part of its military campaigns. It's outlawed, both food and medicine. The real problem has been that directly and indirectly some of the sanctions levied on countries like Russia and Iran have had that effect. And so it's not an issue in which both sides, one is completely absolved, the other has engaged in it. It's something that in one way or another in this conflict has affected both sides. It's a long, checkered, difficult history. And in my view, it should be stopped. And in my view, there's a perfect opportunity here, which I know the Secretary General of the UN has taken very seriously, to see if he can bring about a cessation of all of this so that, in effect, we are not facing humanitarian tragedies loaded on top of the destruction of the Ukraine-Russia war.
Thomas, you mentioned it before, but the knock-on effect of what's happening in Odessa and other southern ports of Ukraine, it really does give an international reach, which of course is what President Putin is planning. What we see immediately when these strikes happen is that wheat prices spike on the world markets straight away. After the strikes and, of course, after the Russian withdrawal from the grain deal. And that knock-on effect comes to Western countries in the form of higher inflation on our food prices.
That's certainly one of the many impacts of what's going on. I would not wish to put that at the top of the list. Countries which are now experiencing economic inflation are in general capable of handling the imports of food commodities, even if the prices have gone up. I would be much more deeply concerned about a large number of African countries who cannot afford food prices the way they are now, depend very heavily on international assistance. And what the Russians are doing with respect to grain supplies is, in effect, doing everything they can to make it difficult to provide for the humanitarian needs of a large number of people who are not in a position to provide for themselves.
Can I just finally ask you about the role of Turkey and President Erdogan here? Putin has been accused by the West of weaponizing food. But Putin also stressed that he wouldn't return to the UN deal until Russia's own exports of grain and fertilizer were guaranteed. How much of an influence can Putin's relationship with President Erdogan of Turkey have on that situation?
If President Erdogan is in any way attempting to control Russian food and fertilizer exports through its management of the ship traffic in the Bosporus and the Dardanelles, then it's in a very strong position to do what it can to open up these passages for Russian grain shipments against, obviously, some checking to make sure, in fact, that they're destined for places they're supposed to go to and that they have humanitarian impact that's designed to make that happen, just as it's in a similar position to assure that Ukrainian grain shipments get the same sort of treatment. And I think this is fully in keeping with Turkey's treaty responsibilities in dealing with this issue. So perhaps it's in a stronger position to give the Russians the kind of assurance they seek. I do not believe it's in the interest of anybody to seek to find ways to restrict anybody's grain shipments as long as they're going to be destined to people in need, are humanitarian in that regard, not supporting a war somewhere, and are part of a general international effort to assure that we don't lump food shortages on top of other tragedies for this war.
Thomas, great to have your company tonight. Thanks very much for joining us.
Good to talk to you, and thank you again for the time.
Thomas Pickering there, former United States ambassador to Russia and the United Nations.